During the 1950s, World War II was just ending and the economy was thriving. While the men were away, women started working and kept their jobs after the war ended. Now families have two incomes and the standard of living greatly increased. People started moving from suburb to city because of growing incomes and families, and this allowed people to start owning houses instead of apartments. Population in America grew 28 million. The standard of living increased, allowing middle-class Americans being able to go to college, which then allowed more people to get higher education and better paying jobs. The unemployment rate was about 5% during the time, and in the early years, the GDP was at 8%. American families were typical back then, a mother and a father with an average of 2 kids. Divorce was hardly heard of. The government launched campaigns encouraging women to stay or get involved in the workplace. More businesses started rising like childcare, nurses, midwives, cleaners, clerical staff, and etc. More businesses that started rising meant more jobs opened at a huge increase in tax, especially income taxes that correspondingly also increased the government services that they could provide. Higher taxes also generated tax revenue to reduce budget deficits and finance new social programs to reduce income inequality.
In the 60s, Medicare and Medicaid was put into place by the government when President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the act to help elderly and poor Americans possibly prolong their lifetime. May consumer tax dollars go towards this act in a way for the U.S. to be able to help. The money going into it grew into 2.1% of the tax dollars going into this act. But during these years, the economy started to slow down. It became obvious that the tax code needed to be adjusted. The Tax Reform Act required high-income earners and corporations to pay their fair share of taxes. The act also offered tax cuts that lowered the tax rates for individuals and increased tax exemptions for the lower-income groups. This affected American families because they started being careful with how they spent their money. In 1969, President Johnson decided to introduce a 10% income tax, which considered by many economists and slowed down the economy. During this time, the OPEC was formed, better known as the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. This was formed for countries in the Middle East who exported oil to big U.S. corporations. It created better pricing and better coordination for the U.S. economy as a whole.
During the 70s, the Vietnam War harshly impacted the American economy. The war rose inflation, which caused interest rates to rise. Production facilities created an imbalance in the industrial sector because they started producing materials and resources for the military instead of consumer goods. This led to controversy with the American people on how the government handled its economic policy. Funds were now going overseas and created an imbalance of payments. Since no funds were coming back to the country, this caused a weak dollar, which affected consumers' confidence. People now started to take their money out of banks and stop using loans. Inflation was also fueled because of the social spending and military expenditures created budget deficits. Interest rates also rose, restricting the amount of capital available for consumers and businesses. Businesses were greatly affected negatively because inflation was high, so consumer purchasing decreased. Inflation caused the businesses to change their prices and make them higher. Investing becomes hard and employee wages are struggling because of the lessening of the dollar over time. The unemployment rose to higher than 5%. The GDP in the later parts of the war never rose above 5%. President Johnson for 2 years didn't see the war as an all-out war, so he held up on asking Congress to tax to finance the war, which resulted in a huge hole in our financial budget. Johnson also didn't want to hold on the Great Society programs, which created more financial debt. Resources needed for the war also pushed the economy, which led the Council for Economic Advisors to suggest non-inflationary growth. After 2 years of non-taxing, Johnson finally started taxing 6% for both individuals and corporate taxes. Congress didn't pass the tax until 1968, which meant that even though legislation was levying taxes, government law, which increased $10 billion in tax money, decreased $6 billion in spending. But Congress was unable to budget with the $6 billion in spending reduction. The inflation of the war was a huge factor in the breakdown of the Johnson administration.